Last week, we took Winston Churchill up to the beginning of the war. And you know that war came on September 1st, 1939, when German panzer divisions rumbled past the Polish frontier in the very early hours of that Sunday morning. A shaken British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, who we'll talk more about in a few minutes, desperate for unity, at least in his own ranks of the Conservative Party, asked its principal assailer to join the cabinet as First Lord of the Admiralty. And you know what they did? They flashed to the fleet, "Winston is back." Because remember, he had been First Lord of the Admiralty in the First World War. For Churchill, the years in the wilderness had been oddly luxuriant and fruitful. Far from the corridors of power that had darkened with dishonor, he had at last ripened with wisdom and respect. I happen to believe that his providential detachment from ministries whose mediocrity would only have encumbered him had allowed him to write, to become a historian, to become the order statesman that he became, a critic, a prophet. He had chosen to await his fate, and now he was being rewarded. I am often reminded of Will Durant's famous statement, "His eloquence was worth 1,000 divisions." And it's true. Churchill, we are told, mobilized the English language. As Winston Churchill resumed his old desk at the Admiralty, it was a case of history repeating itself, not so much with a vengeance as with a pardon. For here was Churchill, once more sitting in the same chair from which he had been so cruelly dismissed after Gallipoli in 1915. Behind him was even the same map of the North Sea, which he had then plotted the deployment of the German fleet in World War I. My friends, in the fall of 1939, the situation hardly qualified as a full-scale war. Do you remember the phony war? Some of you in the room are old enough, or at least you have some memory of being told about the phony war. Everybody thought it would be dramatic, instantaneous. It was, as Churchill called it, the trance, or that twilight war. On land, behind the Maginot Line, and you all understand the significance of the Maginot Line, it was viewed as impregnable, sort of like the Bar-Lev Line was in 1973 in the Yom Kippur War. French troops remained poised, as if in a catatonic state. In the almost perpetual dusk of Northern and Baltic Sea, the ships of Churchill's fleet passed as silent convoy through U-boat infested waters. It was a phony war. It wasn't real yet. People were not dying in large numbers. Oh, that is to say, they were in Poland, but that was it. And so the question emerged, what would happen? When Britain declared war, after the German invasion of Poland in September of 1939, Chamberlain's words were an explanation of his actions before the bar of world opinion. And this is what Prime Minister Chamberlain said. "You can imagine what a bitter blow it was to me that all my long struggle to win peace had failed. Yet I cannot believe that there is anything different I could have done. We have a clear conscience. Interesting, because in a few minutes, I'm going to reflect with you on what Churchill said a few months later when Chamberlain died. But you understand, and I explained it last week, but I just want to repeat it. Chamberlain was prepared to go to any length to avoid conflict. The flower of Britain's youth had been decimated in the First World War, and Churchill did not want to see a repetition. Compare the defensiveness of a Churchill to the defiance that, rather the defensiveness of Chamberlain to the defiance of Churchill on the same day. The Prime Minister said it was a sad day, and that indeed is true. But it seems to me there is another note which may be present at this moment. There is a feeling of thankfulness that if these trials were to come upon our island, there is a generation of Britons here now ready to prove that it has not been unworthy of those great men, the fathers of our land. Here is no question of fighting for Danzig or fighting for Poland. We are fighting to save the world from a perilous Nazi tyranny. And in defense of all that, it's most sacred to man. There is no war for the imperial aggrandizement or material gain. It is a war pure in its inherent quality, a war to establish an impregnable rock, the right of the individual. It is a war to establish and revive the stature of man. Now, I want you to think about the contrast. Chamberlain defensively having to say, I did everything I could, and I'm so disappointed. Versus Churchill, who drew the lines clearly, precisely. While Chamberlain was wringing his hands, Churchill was shaking his fist. It's the best use of language that I could explain. Chamberlain viewed the war as a depressing duty, but Churchill saw it as the ultimate challenge. This is the difference between two men. In his first speech to the Free Trade Hall at the beginning of 1940, the First Lord of the Admiralty closed his speech on the naval war with a peroration of short verbal phrases, sublime in their simplicity. Do you remember when I went over with you Churchill's very famous talk about oratory, the scaffolding of rhetoric? That was his definition of how you got a point across. Come then, let us to the task, to the battle, to the toil, each to our part, each to our station. Fill the armies, rule the air, pour out the munitions, strangle the U-boats, sweep the mines, plow the land, build the ships, guard the streets, succor the wounded, uplift the downcast, and honor the brave. Let us go forward together in all parts of the empire, in all parts of the island. There is not a week, not a day, not an hour to lose. Now, why do I spend a moment on rhetoric? Because we have to understand that what Churchill did was to mobilize the English language. The British had nothing. They didn't have an army that could fight. They didn't have a fleet that could fight. They were defenseless. And one man and his rhetoric sent hope and fear at the same time. That was Winston Churchill's tone. And all that England had begun to ask in 1940 was for him to be leader, to lead. Let me explain the timing so you understand it. In the early hours of the 10th of May, 1940, the Germans invaded Holland and Belgium. You understand your geography of Europe? Very important to understand. And within 4 days, they had broken through the French defenses. On the 15th of May, Holland surrendered. 5 days. And Churchill flew to Paris to confer with the French leaders. It soon became clear that French resistance could not long continue, that the position of the British troops on the continent was perilous. At a meeting of the War Cabinet on the 18th of May, Chamberlain urged the Prime Minister to broadcast to the nation. Chamberlain was appealing now to Churchill, who had become Prime Minister, and we'll talk about it. But let me explain. It wasn't a slam dunk that Churchill would become Prime Minister. Lord Halifax, the British Foreign Minister, had the backing of most people. Now, he was Lord Halifax, so he sat in the House of Lords, not in the House of Commons. He would have had to surrender his seat in the House of Lords in order to become Prime Minister. But more than that, there was a real fear, because Halifax had been an appeaser. I almost brought his book in. So I have his book inscribed. It's a very interesting tomb. I have it next to Churchill in my library to remind me of the contrast. And the Churchill volume is signed, of course, as well. But it's interesting to note that King George did not favor Churchill. He favored Halifax. And you will see in the movie that will be shown in the next, after this class, that there were groups of people in Parliament, including Halifax, who is portrayed in the film, who absolutely thought they could cut a deal with Hitler. They thought there might be a way to avoid war. And of course, we know, and you will see it in the film, that there was actually an intent to negotiate a deal with Hitler. I want you to know, after Churchill's being urged to speak, after he became Prime Minister, there were only 3 hours that he had to compose his speech. This is your first time as Prime Minister. People are demoralized, and you have to direct them. This is what he said, and it was broadcast on the BBC. The date was May 19th, 1940. I speak to you for the first time as Prime Minister in a solemn hour for the life of our country, of our empire, of our allies, and above all, of the cause of freedom. Can you imagine sitting in front of a radio and hearing your new Prime Minister, who many had accused of being a fool, say those words? They were short. They were direct. He went on to say, a tremendous battle is raging in France and Flanders. the Germans, by a remarkable combination of air bombing and heavily armored tanks, have broken through the French defenses north of the Maginot Line, and strong columns of their armored vehicles are ravaging the open country, which, well, stop and think for a minute. Imagine using the term ravaging. Can you all picture in your minds what that term meant? And now I want you to picture this. You all understand what happened. The British people had no idea what was going to happen. They didn't know whether they could succeed. And they had little faith in their government, which had failed. Hitler singled out Churchill as the arch enemy of Germany from the start, and with good reason. As the Nazi war machine engulfed all the territory across the North Sea and English Channel, Churchill delivered a series of fierce and moving speeches. I have them all here. And provided a catalyst for the nation's courage and spirit of defiance. I hope you took seriously my suggestion that you hear the Edward R. Murrow recording of Winston Churchill. And that series of clips, it runs an hour. If you haven't, just go to YouTube and punch in Winston Churchill and Edward R. Murrow, and you can hear. And I want to remind you, Churchill spoke with a stutter. I want to remind you that Churchill composed his own speeches, that he labored over what he would say. On the 13th of May, 1940, the speech I just suggested to you, he spoke to the House of Commons as Prime Minister for the first time and offered nothing but, do you remember the expression? Blood, toil, tears, and sweat. Can you imagine? I want you to think about it. The nation is about to go to war. The continent of Europe is aflame. You don't have the tools to do the job, but you have to create the illusion. And that's what Winston Churchill did. At the beginning of June, the British Army and part of the French Army were trapped at Dunkirk. Although in 9 days, in an almost miraculous effort, 140,000 troops were removed. And do you understand the miracle here? All Hitler had to do was bomb them. It would have been like shooting ducks in a barrel. But for some reason, some twist of fate, some incredible moment, the Germans did not attack. And you know what happened. Small boats sailed from England. Yachts sailed from England. Fishing boats sailed from England to Dunkirk. And they picked people up and they brought them back. Do you understand? Can you grasp how moving it was? By the way, it wasn't the Navy that accomplished the evacuation. It was the people themselves mobilized for the fight. And then the unthinkable. France fell. But Churchill never admitted the possibility of defeat. Never. He urged the French not to despair. He broadcast constantly to his own people, and in every speech was the unmistakable tone of dogged confidence in the outcome. You ask me, what is our aim? I answer, in one word, it is victory. By the way, Churchill spoke French rather badly, and he addressed the people of France. And when you listen to the Edward R. Murrow recording, you'll hear him in his rather mediocre French. I took French for 4 years, and believe me, I can hardly understand what he said. These speeches gave his beleaguered countrymen the will to carry on. In June of 1940, the French government left Paris, and the Germans entered the city. France sued for an armistice, and Britain was alone. Now, I want you again to think for a moment about what it meant when France fell. I won't ask you whether you were old enough to remember, but I can tell you, when Hitler entered Paris, he visited for a day with Albert Speer, his architect, at his side. They went to La Tour Eiffel. They went to the Eiffel Tower. But I will tell you what I remember as a kid studying this was when they went to the tomb of Napoleon in Les Invalides. When I took my children to the tomb of Napoleon, I had them stand in the exact spot where Hitler stood. And I tried to explain to them the power of that moment. I need to pause here and offer another reflection. In the United States of America, there was a great battle between isolationism and intervention. Charles Lindbergh, the aviator hero, was one of the leaders who articulated the idea of isolation and the slogan, America First. And he was joined in this by many, many leading Republicans. And I want you to understand, not that I want to draw any modern day analogies, but the Republican Party was engaged in a bitter battle between isolationism and intervention. And the leading Republican candidate for president was Robert A. Taft, the son of President William Howard Taft. Bob, the president's son, he knows how to do it. He'll get it done. That was one of the ditties they made up. And Bob Taft was a bright, articulate, very conservative isolationist. And he was joined in that by Arthur Vandenberg. Arthur Vandenberg, the senator from Michigan, who also was a viable contender for the presidency that year, was a staunch isolationist who, just so you know for the record, became an internationalist, realized he'd made terrible errors, and was here at the founding conference of the United Nations in San Francisco as a delegate because Franklin Roosevelt said, I need to have an isolationist who is now an internationalist. And then there was Thomas E. Dewey, who was the favorite to be the nominee. Now, Dewey had a problem. He was governor of New York, but he couldn't decide whether he was an isolationist or an interventionist. So he sort of straddled the fence, trying to decide what place to go. And if at the end of June 1940, when the Republicans gathered in convention in Philadelphia, it appeared that they would nominate an isolationist. But something happened, which I have to tell you, I believe was one of the great miracles. And that was that they nominated Wendell Lewis Wilkie of Indiana. Wilkie was an interventionist. He was a Wilsonian, by the way, in the days when Woodrow Wilson was still very popular. Wilsonian politics said, you have to fight for your country. You have to intervene. Wilkie was a great advocate, by the way, for Zionism, for the rights of Jews. He spoke out eloquently on these subjects. And when the Republicans met in convention, France had just fallen. And I must tell you, without any hesitation, that Wilkie's nomination by the Republican Party on the 6th ballot at that convention helped turn the course of the war. Because Wilkie had a hero, and his name was Winston Churchill. So I want you to be aware that while Britain was alone, there was hope. Because in the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, though not yet an interventionist, was fully supportive of Britain. He was the Democratic nominee for president. And the Republican nominee for president was Wendell Willkie, who was an interventionist. And so, when Churchill came to Roosevelt, and what he really wanted, what he desperately wanted, was for the United States to intervene immediately on behalf of Britain. This was Churchill's dream. He knew that Britain could not stand alone forever, but he knew that if the United States intervened, all would be well. And then came an idea called Lend-Lease. This is the middle of the 1940 presidential campaign. And Franklin Roosevelt proposes that we lend to Britain our used battleships and antiquated materials. Now, let me explain why I mentioned this. In his memoirs, Winston Churchill writes that the reason this worked was because it was bipartisan, because Wendell Willkie supported Lend-Lease. Had America not committed to helping Britain, my God. And let's spend a moment on the Battle of Britain. The gratitude of every home in the British Isle for the defense of Britain and the Empire, and indeed throughout the world, except in those areas controlled by Germany. The sentiment went out to British airmen who, undaunted by odds, unwearied by their constant challenge and mortal danger, turned the tide of the war. They went against the Luftwaffe. Do you remember Charles Lindbergh went to Germany in 1937 and he said, the German Air Force is impregnable. And the RAF, the small but valiant group of Brits, fired back. Churchill was to say, never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. Now, do you understand what inspired people? It was not just Churchill's oratory. It was also the fact that the people of Britain were unified in their understanding that if they failed, the world would be lost. Thus, Churchill echoed the thanks of the British people to the gallantry of those young men and women who, vastly outnumbered, hurled their Spitfire and Hurricanes at the waves of Luftwaffe aircraft intent upon destroying Britain. I want you to know that all this came alive because of a newsman, Edward R. Murrow. Now, Murrow was not completely detached. He was very biased in his reporting. But if you remember, or you've seen the film of Murrow standing on the rooftops of London, "This is London," he said. And he described in great detail, with all the power of his voice, what was happening. And although we couldn't see the flames, through his imagery, those flames crackled in our minds and in our hearts. By the way, at the time, Winston Churchill's son, Randolph, was married to Pamela. And Edward R. Murrow had an affair with Pamela. But so did Averil Harriman, who finally made an honest woman of her by marrying her. And that's why we celebrate Pamela Harriman, who you will recall was named the American ambassador to France by Bill Clinton. Now, you may say that this was slightly incestuous. And I would say, absolutely. You must know that the Germans hit relentlessly. And at the end of the summer of 1940, the power of German Air Force had turned London into an inferno. People were demoralized, they thought. This wicked man, this repository of the embodiment of many forms of self-destroying hatred. That's how he described Hitler. He didn't spare his language. But the long-threatened blitzkrieg on London was launched on September the 7th, 1940. There are no words to describe the terror. When I first went to London, I was 10 years old. It was the summer of 1959. So the people I talked to, and I was a kid who always asked questions. And I would ask people, what was it like? And it was hard for them to describe the terror. Night after night, German bombers rammed and rained their deadly cargo of explosives and firebombs in the ancient city. And remember, when those incendiaries hit, buildings burst into flames. It wasn't just the bombing. How were these buildings built? With wood. Refusing to take shelter. Winston Churchill, in his famous suit, regardless of danger, would watch the bombing from the roof of the Air Ministry and go down into the bombed areas with his cigar, his tin hat, to the bombed out people of the East End. I want you to think about this. Fearless. But you know, as I mentioned in a previous lecture, Churchill had nearly lost his life so many times. He believed, whether you want to believe it or not, that destiny had chosen him and he would survive. Often, he was moved to tears by the suffering and the courage and the evident affection for himself. When they saw him, you can imagine, in the middle of all of this, all of a sudden you see the prime minister walking among you. Good old Winnie, they called him, reflecting the anger of these people. Churchill condemned Hitler with disgust. I've just chosen a few of his words. These cruel, wanton, indiscriminate bombings of London are, of course, a part of Hitler's invasion plans. He hopes by killing large numbers of civilians and women and children that he will terrorize and cow the people of this mighty imperial city. This is going on, and he's out there proclaiming, don't stop fighting. And you know what was amazing? The British did continue. They went down into the subway, into the metro, for shelter. They came out as soon as the all clear sounded. And of course, Hitler normally had Goering send the Luftwaffe over at night. Terrifying. Homes, warehouses, the shops, the churches perished in the flames. Burning, broken buildings. The smell was through the air. Everyone smelled it. But Churchill remained the symbol of unflagging faith in the ultimate outcome. He believed with perfect faith. Now, while all this is going on, there are several things that I have to reflect with you upon. It was their finest hour. That's the title of the movie. But it wasn't fiction. It was real. This great orator was delivered partly from this agony by being able to stand before his people and voice expression. I want you to be aware that Churchill was unflappable in his determination. When he spoke to the House of Commons on the 20th of August, 1940, France had been defeated. The threat of German attack on Britain was the government's prime concern during the late summer. In the skies, the Battle of Britain raged throughout most of August and September. Churchill himself was an occasional visitor to the operation room at number 11. Some of you here have been to his headquarters underground during the war. I referred to it earlier. I have the guidebook here. And he said what I said earlier, he said. Never in the field of human conflict has so much been owed by so many to so few. And I should tell you, there were Americans who volunteered to serve in the RAF. You know, in those days, if you did something like that, you could lose your citizenship. In those days, if you fought for an army other than the United States, you could lose your citizenship. But Americans came because they understood that we were on the line too. Harold Nicholson, while approaching the reference to the few, thought merely a moderate and well-balanced speech. because people didn't appreciate. The top people didn't get it. But the people being bombed understood. This was his speech on the 20th of August, 1940. Almost a year has passed since the war began, and it is natural for us, I think, to pause on our journey at this moment and survey the dark. He said to them, no matter how dark, have hope. We will be okay. Now, several things happened that I have to recount to you for a moment. The first was that Lend-Lease brought hope. We were now involved from a distance. I want you to be aware that in this period of time when America was neutral, we continued to support the effort. In the election of 1940, Franklin Roosevelt won decisively. But on the eve of his inauguration as president, January 20th, 1941, he had a visitor at the White House, Wendell Willkie. Roosevelt was sending Willkie to Britain. Roosevelt couldn't go himself, but he wanted the British people to understand. And Roosevelt penned a note quoting Emerson. Sail on, O ship of state. Sail on, O Union, strong and great. He wanted Britain to understand that we stood together. And when Churchill addressed the people, he read the note. Humanity, with all its fears and all its hopes for future years, is riding breathless on thy fate. Do you know what Willkie did when he was in London? He put on a hard hat. He walked the streets as Churchill had. He went into the pubs. There's even a clip, you can see it online, of his doing darts in a pub in Britain. Willkie wanted to express the sentiment that Roosevelt felt. We will stand with you, no matter what. Roosevelt sent his top aide, Harry Hopkins, who was a frail man, not in particularly good health. Nobody really knew of the relationship between Harry Hopkins and Franklin Roosevelt. They were close friends. Hopkins actually lived at the White House. When he got married the second time, he was married at the White House, and his daughter lived in the White House with him. Hopkins, well, there's a book by Robert Sherwood called Roosevelt and Hopkins, and I recommend it to you highly. Brilliant expression. Hopkins was very coy. And here it is, January of 1941. And Churchill said to him as he was leaving, "What will you say to the president? What will you say to your president?" And Hopkins quoted the book of Ruth. Whither thou goest, I will go. Your God will be my God. Your people my people. Churchill wept. He understood. Now, by the way, this did not prevent the agony which took place in the United States in 1941. The battle between isolationism and interventionism. Do you know that on the eve of Pearl Harbor, half of the country opposed intervention? And Franklin Roosevelt was worried. There were many who pressured him, understanding what was happening to the Jews, to stand up, be more vigorous. And Roosevelt was sensitive to the fact, and perhaps slightly driven by the Jew hatred that he had grown up with, that we could not enter the Second World War to save the Jews. There had to be more. And yet, I want you to know, while all of this was going on, something happened in Britain, and I think it is a reflection of Churchill's character. We talk about intervention and isolationism. Remember, in Britain, the battle was between appeasement or striking back. When Churchill formed his government, he included Neville Chamberlain, the former prime minister. In September of 1940, it became clear that Neville Chamberlain, who had served Churchill loyally in the wartime coalition as Lord President, and who had been responsible for the domestic side of the war, was dying of cancer. He resigned his post in government and also as leader of the Conservative Party, because although Churchill was prime minister, Chamberlain remained the leader of the Conservative Party. Churchill was urged to accept the party leadership, and despite the opposition of his wife, he did so the following month. But he continued to keep Chamberlain in close touch with the war until Chamberlain's death in November of 1940. My friends, the two men had disagreed violently and publicly before 1939. And Churchill always maintained that Chamberlain bore a large responsibility for the deficiencies of Britain's defenses at the outbreak of the war. However, and this is the human side of Churchill that we don't generally see, but we have to understand. He genuinely admired Chamberlain's courage and loyalty. And he felt very keenly the lack of a senior figure from the Conservative Party who would control the domestic aspects of the war effort. He rose in the House of Commons on the 12th of November, 1940, and he delivered a eulogy. I'm not going to read you the whole thing, but I want you to hear a little bit of it. This is the 12th of November, 1940. Since we last met, the House has suffered a very grievous loss in the death of one of the most distinguished members and one of a statesman and public servant who during the best part of 3 memorable years was First Minister of the Crown. The fierce and bitter controversy which hung around him in recent times was hushed by the news of his illness and are silenced by his death. In paying tribute and respect and regard to an eminent man who had been taken from us, no one is obliged to alter the opinions which he has formed or expressed upon issues which have become a part of our history. But he went on to say, at this moment, we may all pass our own conduct and our own judgments under a searching review. He was trying to say that Chamberlain was a great man. And I want to just share this part of the eulogy because I was so moved by it. I had the most singular experience of passing in a day from being one of the most preeminent opponents and critics of being one of his principal lieutenants. And in another, that's when he became First Lord of the Admiralty. And on another day of passing from serving under him to becoming the head of a government of which, with perfect loyalty, he was content to be a member. Such relationships are unusual in our public life. I have before told the House how on the morrow of the debate, which in the early days of May challenged his position, he declared to me and a few other friends that only a national government could face the storm which was about to break upon us, and that if he were an obstacle to the formation of such a government, he would instantly retire. Therefore, he acted with that singleness of purpose and simplicity of conduct which at all times, and especially in great times, ought to be the ideal of us all. Imagine. This was his mortal political enemy. This was the man he had accused of stripping Britain of the ability to fight a war. Can you imagine responding in such a fashion? When he returned to duty a few weeks after a most severe operation, the bombardment of London and of the seat of government had begun. I was a witness during the fortnight of his fortitude under the most grievous and painful bodily afflictions, and I can testify that, although physically only the wreck of a man, his nerve was unshakable, and his remarkable mental faculties were unimpaired. After he left the government, he refused all honors. He would die like his father, plain Mr. Chamberlain. I sought permission of the king, however, to have him supplied with the cabinet papers, and that until a few days of his death, he followed our affairs with keenness, interest, and tenacity. He met the approach of death with a steady eye. If he grieved at all, it was that he could not be a spectator to our victory. But I think he died with the comfort of knowing that his country had at last turned the corner. At this time, our thoughts must pass to the gracious and charming lady who shared his days of triumph and adversity with a courage and quality equal to his own. He was, like his father and his brother Austin before him, a famous member of the House of Commons, and we here assembled this morning, members of all parties, without a single exception, feel that we do ourselves and our country honor in saluting the memory of one whom Disraeli would have called an English worthy. Now, you might ask yourself, why waste precious time describing the relationship between Chamberlain and Churchill? How do you determine the essence of greatness? What is it that makes a person great? And I will tell you that one of the most important things is what Churchill articulated: respect for even those with whom you disagree. And then, oh my goodness, I'm looking at the clock. May I tell you, the great enemy is the clock. So I have to give you a break. I'm required to do so. But when we come back, Churchill's famous address to us: give us the tools and we'll finish the job. All right, take a break, then I'll finish the job. It's exactly right.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hitler took the Channel Islands.
Yes.
Owned by England.
Yes.
And he wanted to do a model occupation.
And there's a
show.
film. Have
Yeah.
you seen the film of that?
I lived in France, and then I went to Guernsey and Jersey several times, so I got really into it. But yeah. But then he wanted to show the English people if he could do a model occupation, and they shouldn't be. He wouldn't treat them like Poland and other.
Yes.
But that's fascinating.
I love it. I love it.
Yeah. So thank you. Great course.
I'm trying.
Navy played a big part.
Yes. I can't cover it all. I'm doing the best I can.
Yeah. They were really good.
Yes. Yes. 100%. 100%. What? I can't hear you. Oh! Yes, but the house, no. You're absolutely right, but the house's support system was wood, and that's why they burst into flames. And that was a big problem. And as the brick dropped away and the wood was exposed, it was a disaster. Yeah, on wood. I'm telling you. Oh, yeah. Oh, yes. Yes.
My understanding was that Halifax was the candidate Conservative Party wanted to succeed Jim.
He was the candidate with the king and Chamberlain.
But basically, one of the reasons Churchill became prime minister was that Clement Attlee would not join a national government. Winston Churchill was prime minister.
You'll see it in the movie.
And they had to have Clement Attlee in there with the Labour Party to make a national government. So
yes,
a big movement.
100%. Absolutely right.
And when was the Constitution Amendment to change the date of inauguration from March to January?
Because when
wasn't that changed after the war?
No, it was changed in 1937.
Oh,
and the reason is because the period between the election in November 32 and the inauguration, which was March 4th, was too long.
Because of the Depression.
Yes. So they shortened.
1937.
Yeah, January 20th.
Because when you mentioned January 20th, I thought somebody thought that okay, yeah. Here,
oh yes.
Thank you. Let's get back to your studying.
Oh, I'm not studying. I'm going to give you the Atlantic Charter, but I wanted to make sure I have the text with me.
Was that in March of 41?
You'll get it.
Good. Thank you.
Yes.
John, there was a wonderful TV series, and I remember it was in 1962, the year I graduated high school, which was called Winston Churchill's History of the Second World War.
Yes, yes.
And it had Richard Burton
right.
saying his things. It had, I'm trying to think, Betty Davis's husband, one of her many husbands. Right. He did that. And I can't find it. I have been on Amazon. I've Googled.
No, it exists. Go on YouTube. I'm sure it's there. Actually, okay. I have the book. There was
there's 5 volumes.
Yeah. No, not this. Not his war memoirs. There was a book that was put together with illustrations. That is all about that particular period. I still have it in my library. Well, I made my mother buy it.
History is 5, and the first one is called The Gathering. Gary Merrill.
Yeah.
Yes. The Gathering Storm, and then The Grand Alliance. You know, all those the famous 5 books there. But I would love to get that because I've learned everything about World War II from that series.
Do you have your computer with you?
No.
Oh, I'm sure it's there.
I'll check it again. I put it through many times because I would love to see it. It was so well done.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Good. See, thanks to you, I now have exactly what I'm looking for.
What was that?
Oh, I have to talk about the Atlantic Charter. I'm squeezing so much in today.
You are.
I can't even begin to. And I only have 2 more sessions.
I know
after this.
you got cheated out of one because of the 2 holidays.
This should be a 6-month class or a 1-year
Yeah,
class.
well, you could have done it.
Right? And Churchill never said Nazi, but he said Nazi.
Yes,
And
you're
it drove Hitler
crazy. You're right.
And it's so because the English are famous. For example, the French, they learn French, but they pronounce it without any attempt to pronounce it the way
You are absolutely right.
Oh.
You're right. Excellent. Oh, good. That's gonna be called me. Two minutes, 2 minutes, 2 minutes. And that's too long.
They sold the French fleet. We didn't have time for that.
I don't. I wish I could. I'm
That
sorry.
showed Roosevelt they weren't fooling around.
Yeah.
And that's why there's no great love between the French and the British even now.
If you will take your seats, please. All right, ladies and gentlemen. I want you to know time is my enemy. So I want, if I can, and so a number of you have asked me questions about things I should cover. I just can't cover it all. It's impossible. So I'm doing the best I can based on the things that I think are important. I want to go back, if I can, to 1941 and the question of an American alliance with Britain. On August the 10th, 1941, there was a meeting with President Roosevelt on board the Prince of Wales. It was one of the most significant meetings in human history. And I want you to know, my cousin's husband was given a copy of the Atlantic Charter signed by Roosevelt and Churchill. His son now has it. But I want you to know, just seeing it was an inspiration. I want, if I can now, to share with you the Atlantic Charter. I do so because it is worth reflecting on the fact that the course of history was changed by this document. Roosevelt and Churchill met, and they agreed. This is before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. It was an 8-point document. Though it reveals the Churchill hand, it is less significant for its style than its substance. It was the first call by the Allies for a United Nations. There were 8 points. First, their countries, Britain and the United States, seek no aggrandizement, territorial or other. And this is very important. Churchill was an imperialist. He wanted to preserve the British Empire. And so to begin with the first point, that there would be no territorial acquisition, was astounding. Second, they desire to see no territorial changes that do not accord with the freely expressed wishes of the people concerned. Do you remember at the end of the First World War, the Versailles Treaty? This was a message to the world that we would not do that again. Third, they respect the rights of all people to choose the form of government under which they will live. Do you understand how significant that is? The idea, particularly given the state of the world, the assurance that people would have the right of self-determination. This, perhaps, the most important part of the Atlantic Charter. After the final destruction of the Nazi tyranny, they hope to see established a peace which will afford to all nations the means of dwelling in safety within their own boundaries, and which will afford assurance that all men in all the lands may live out their lives in freedom from fear and want. What a marvelous expression. And then this. They believe that all the nations of the world, for realistic as well as spiritual reasons, must come to the abandonment of the use of force. Since no future peace can be maintained if land, sea, or air armaments continue to be employed by nations which threaten or may threaten aggression outside of their frontiers, they believe, pending the establishment of a wider and permanent system of general security, that the disarmament of such nations is essential. But more than in the Charter, Churchill found in the Sunday church service held on the quarter deck beneath the battle guns a tangible expression of common purpose. As the sun broke through the mist that Sunday morning, the hymnful chorus of "Onward, Christian Soldiers" rose to the sky in the mingled voices of two navies, fighting men, as Churchill later retold to the House of Commons, of the same language, of the same faith, of the same fundamental laws, of the same ideals, and now, to a larger extent, of the same interest, and certainly in different degrees, facing the same danger. Now, I'm a nice Jewish boy. When I hear "Onward, Christian Soldiers," what am I supposed to think? But you understand the symbolism was incredible. And there is a film taken by newsreels of that moment. And you understand, there was a common faith. Churchill and Roosevelt were both Episcopalians. They read from the same prayer book, the same hymnal. And the Navy forces assembled on that ship understood the significance. I must tell you, Churchill and Roosevelt, as I think I recounted to you earlier, met in World War I, during World War I. Roosevelt remembered Churchill. Churchill had no memory of meeting Roosevelt. There is another story, which I must tell you. Churchill was very worried in December, the beginning of December of 1941. It appeared that Britain really was alone. The war against Japan was not going well at all. Remember, it wasn't just Germany. And then came December 7th. When Winston Churchill heard the news of the bombing of Pearl Harbor, he wept. He knew that now he could not lose, that the Nazis would be defeated. And he called Roosevelt and he said, "Now we are all in this together." Can you imagine? For Churchill, it was as if a great burden had been lifted. There is a very famous speech that Churchill gave. I only want to allude to it. Around Christmas time, Churchill came to Washington and he stayed at the White House. And the story I'm going to tell you now is recounted many times, but was told to me vividly by Jimmy Roosevelt, President Roosevelt's eldest son. Churchill and Roosevelt were trying to figure out what the name of the alliance should be. The Allied powers. And all of a sudden, Churchill had this, well, epiphany, and so did Roosevelt. And Roosevelt wheeled himself down the corridor of the White House to Churchill's room and burst in. And there was Churchill standing stark naked, just having gotten out of his bath. Do you think Churchill was embarrassed? Not at all. He stuck out his chest, strutted his stuff, and said, "The Prime Minister of the British Empire has nothing to hide from the President of the United States." It is quite astounding, is it not? But there was more. Churchill was invited to address Congress. Now, I have to pause and tell you what very few people knew. While Churchill was at the White House, he had a stroke, a slight stroke, and you can read about it in Dr. Moran, his personal physician, describing it. But Churchill was an actor, and he knew that much depended upon what he could do. And frankly, if you didn't know he'd had a stroke, you wouldn't have noticed. Churchill wanted to convey something in his rhetorical message to Congress the day after Christmas, December the 26th, 1941. Seated behind him were Sam Rayburn, Speaker of the House of Representatives, and Henry A. Wallace, the Vice President of the United States, and assembled both houses of Congress. With an allusion to both his mother and his Revolutionary War ancestry, this is how Churchill opened the speech. Members of the Senate and House of Representatives, the fact that my American forebears have for so many generations played a part in the life of the United States, and that here I am, an Englishman, welcomed into your midst. This experience makes this experience one of the most moving and thrilling of my life, which is already long and has not been entirely uneventful. I wish indeed that my mother, whose memory I cherish across the veil of years, could have been here to see me. And then he said this. All should remember it. By the way, I cannot help reflecting that if my father had been American and my mother British, instead of the other way around, I might have got here on my own. In this case, that would not be the first time you have heard my voice. In that case, I would not have needed an invitation, but if I had it, hardly likely, it would have been unanimous. So perhaps things are better this way. With humor, reminding Congress of that close alliance, Churchill made an impression. You can actually hear him say the words if, when you go to YouTube, you Google "I Can Hear It Now," Edward R. Murrow again, the period of this 1940-41, and you can hear him say it. We were still in the midst of a struggle. This is important because after he left Washington, Churchill went to Canada and he addressed the Canadian Parliament. After extolling the contributions of Canadian soldiers and flyers to the defense of Britain, Churchill identified all English-speaking people with their cousins in besieged Britain. He said this: I should like to point out to you that we have not at any time asked for any mitigation in the fury of malice of the enemy. The peoples of the British Empire may love peace. They do not seek the lands of wealth of any country, but they are a tough and hardy lot. We have not journeyed all this way across the centuries, across the oceans, across the mountains, across the prairies, because we are made of sugar candy. Look at the Londoners, the Cockneys. Look at what they have stood up to. Grim and gay with their cry, "We can take it!" And their wartime mood of, what is good enough for anybody is good enough for us. We have not asked that the rulers of the game should be modified. We shall not descend to the Germans and the Japanese level. But if anybody likes to play rough, we can play rough too. Then, in the language of the biblical prophet, he thundered a fateful judgment. Hitler and his Nazi gang have sown the wind. Let them reap the whirlwind. Shifting tones, with a never-to-be-forgotten earthy retort, Churchill coined his own slogan. When I warned them, the French, that Britain would fight on alone whatever they did, their generals told their prime minister and his divided cabinet, in 3 weeks, England will have its neck wrung like a chicken. Churchill paused And then, roaring back, hurled these words, "Some chicken!" Before he could finish, the Canadians were on their feet cheering. And then he added, "Some neck!" The uproar doubled again amid gales of laughter. Later, Churchill, who was puzzled but not unhappy with the reaction, was told the neck in Canadian slang meant nerve or brass. He didn't know it. A double entendre, and it worked. Journeying back to Washington, Churchill celebrated New Year's Eve on the train. As the train neared Brattleboro, Vermont, he strode from his compartment to the dining car, armed with cigar and brandy. With a car full of reporters and staff aside, he gave a toast. "Here's to 1942, a year of toil, a year of struggle, a year of peril, but a long step toward victory." But the year was almost over before that first long step was recorded, which for Britain was the turning point of the war. The victory at El Alamein. In my book, our book, Icon of Evil, Hitler's Mufti and the Rise of Radical Islam, we describe vividly what would have happened if Hitler had won at El Alamein. The Desert Fox, Erwin Rommel, the commander of the forces, Hitler's intent, which he expressed and which was expressed to the Mufti of Jerusalem, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, was that once they conquered Egypt, they would conquer Palestine. And the intention was to take all of the Jews and create death camps in the area around Tel Aviv. It was no joke. I want you to be aware, oh gosh, I hate the clock. I want you to be aware that as I take your questions now in the remaining time, that for Churchill, these moments, 1940, 1941, into 1942, were the height of his power. Now, next week, when we touch on the decline of Britain, I will explain to you that Churchill was never more powerful than at those moments. But do you understand it was not an economic power? It wasn't that the British Empire was impregnable. It was the spirit that he exemplified. That's what mattered. And I do believe very strongly that what Churchill did was to mobilize the English language into battle. Well, let me pause now because, I really owe you an apology because there's so much to cover and I have so little time. Your questions, yes. This is a very important question. Didn't the Atlantic Charter predict the end of colonialism? And the answer is yes. I was going to touch on it more next week, but it's good to repeat things. There was a clash between Roosevelt and Churchill. Roosevelt really wanted to do away with imperialism. He wanted to do away with colonialism. Roosevelt made clear we had no territorial ambitions, none. And that was the antithesis of what Churchill wanted. I did not become the king's first minister to preside over the death of the British Empire. He clung to that concept. And as we will describe, he did not have to preside over the dissolution of the British Empire because he was out of office, but we get to that eventually. Yes. The relationship between Eleanor Roosevelt and Winston Churchill was wonderful. They were good friends till the end of her life in November of 1962. I can only describe it. The families were very close. And when I went to Blenheim Palace, the birthplace of Winston Churchill, my wife and I were walking in and I heard something. It was a recording. It was a record, which I have in my own collection, which I'd always had. It was a recording of James Roosevelt telling the story of Winston Churchill. No, there was a close familial relationship. And by the way, interesting on another level, Winston Churchill had problems with his children. So did Franklin Roosevelt. Being the son or daughter of a great figure is not easy. Randolph Churchill was a great disappointment to his father, but he loved his son. And it was Randolph Churchill, by the way, who wrote the first volume of the life of Churchill. When Randolph Churchill died, that burden was assumed by my old friend Martin Gilbert, Sir Martin Gilbert, with whom I worked on several projects. And Martin Gilbert completed the multi-volume biography of Winston Churchill. But you can, thanks to Martin Gilbert's genius, buy the one volume instead of, I think, 5 or 6 volumes. So, next question. Yes. Yes. Well, hold on, because remember, this is being recorded. So there are a lot of people who take this class who are not in the room. So the observation is that at the height of the Blitz, British children were removed from London. They were taken to rural areas. That was not viewed as a sign of defeatism. It was viewed as a way of saving lives. So Churchill completely supported that. And one of the most touching things you can see when you go back and you watch the films were the parents at the train stations waving goodbye to their children. And you may recall, and you can hear it on the Edward R. Murrow, I Can Hear It Now, Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret, their voices as children, saying goodnight, children. It was incredibly evocative. And I left out, and I apologize for leaving things out. You may recall that King George VI came to the United States with Queen Elizabeth, and they went for supper, a picnic supper at Hyde Park. And somebody said hot dogs. No, they served Frankfurters, as they were called. And when I grew up, my parents called them Frankfurters, not hot dogs. And the king loved it. And they sat not on chairs, but picnic style. It was the embrace of two people who spoke the same language, had the same fundamental faith in God, and who seemed to be about to share a common destiny. When the king and the queen got on the train to leave, do you know what music was played? Old Lang Syne, and it brought tears to the eyes of everyone. It is a fascinating story. You had another point. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Yeah, he's recalling the films that were made that inspired us during the war and the British. And it's true. You know, Hollywood was very careful about how they portrayed what happened. There was a fear that prior to the war, that you shouldn't make films that seemed to prejudice. Now, understand, the movie producers, many of them were Jews, and they had to walk a fine line so that nobody would accuse them of making propaganda. But do you remember the White Cliffs of Dover? Mrs. Miniver? I mean, if I am speaking at a college campus on this period and I mention these films, they have no idea what I'm talking about. There were anti-Nazi films that were made that were incredible, but it required a shift in American public opinion. Hollywood really went to war once Pearl Harbor took place. Now, let me explain, not all of our depictions were positive. So I love comic book figures. And do you remember when you were kids, the serials in the movie houses? Each week there would be a different chapter. And I went to see the Batman serial. It is the most racist, bigoted, the Yellow Peril, the Japanese portrayed with buck teeth and all the rest. And you may recall too, the books of the time. There was a book called Undercover by an Armenian fellow who went by the name John Roy Carlson. He infiltrated all of the Nazi and America First groups in the country, and he wrote a book about it. You want to read a book of high drama? Undercover by John Roy Carlson. It won't cost you more than $1, frankly, but it was tremendously moving. I have often reflected on the power of Hollywood. And when you see this film on Churchill at the end of this class, you will experience how we view him today. But I want you always to remember that for many, Churchill was a crank. The Indians hated him. And frankly, a lot of people in Britain were worried about him. Do you remember the Cliveden set? Lady Astor, Sir Oswald Mosley. They believed in appeasement, and it was hard to break that. The film you're going to see has many remarkable scenes in it, but one of them has to do with this tension that existed. Those who simply wanted to fold their tents. In the case of some of them, they believed they could make a deal with Hitler. And Hitler was encouraged in that belief. I mentioned to you that Churchill never met Hitler face to face. But when he was in Munich in 1932, Putzi Hanfstaengl, who was the aide to Hitler who dealt with the foreign press, nearly arranged a meeting, but Churchill wouldn't meet with Hitler because of Hitler's attitude toward the Jews. That was 1932. And I haven't mentioned Benito Mussolini and Italy. I haven't mentioned the fact that in 1940, prior to France falling, Italy was still a neutral nation. Remember that at the Munich conference in 1938, that Benito Mussolini, along with Daladier of France and Chamberlain of Britain and Adolf Hitler negotiated the Munich Pact. I haven't mentioned, somebody asked me about the sinking of the French fleet. Of course, the French were conflicted. Do you remember who became the head of Vichy? Pierre Laval, who had been, by the way, a great hero in the 1930s, and Marshal Pétain. And if you remember, I mean, it's very difficult for me because I really absorbed this history, that Laval was executed at the end of the war after a trial in France, and he had been a hero. And Marshal Pétain would have been executed, but he was elderly. I think he had Alzheimer's, and so they just let him die a natural death. In his book, The Rise and Fall of the French Republic, William L. Shirer describes the agony of these days. And next question. Sorry, I can go on, so you got to stop me. Yes. Yes. Lord Halifax was a good, honorable, decent man, but he supported the policy of appeasement. Now, let me ask you a question. On this hinges your grade. Where was Lord Halifax during the war? Exactly. Thank you. Whoever said it gets an A+. Churchill dispatched Halifax the appeaser to Washington to be the British ambassador. And I say I have Halifax's memoirs inscribed. And when I read it, I understand. This is the thing that's so difficult, particularly when you're in intense times. You heard President Zelensky of Ukraine literally plagiarize Winston Churchill. Churchill served as an inspiration. And he became more than just a historic figure. He became an icon. I could show you shelves of books. Well, when we get to Churchill's funeral, I won't play it for you. I may read a portion of it. Dwight Eisenhower's eulogy to Winston Churchill. As close as Churchill was to Franklin Roosevelt, he was close to Dwight D. Eisenhower. And when you read Richard Nixon's book, Leaders, his depiction of Churchill, who then was, this is 1959, Churchill already had several strokes. It was his last trip to the United States. But Nixon describes, in fact, one of the books that I have with me is called The Wit and Wisdom of Winston Churchill. And do you know who wrote the introduction? Richard Nixon. Just before he died, by the way. So these are all, have you been to the Nixon Library? If you've never been to Yorba Linda, I'd love to put together a trip leading groups through presidential libraries. I really thought about it. We priced it out. It's just too expensive. But when you go to the Nixon Library, there is a hall of leaders, people Nixon met. And one of the statues is of Winston Churchill. It's really, really quite phenomenal. Next question. What? What? Oh, I'm shocked. No questions? Okay. So I'm supposed to end now anyway, because I'm supposed to give you a potty break. Now, let me explain to you that I have a decision to make before we go to the movie. I will describe to you next week, briefly, if you want to read up on it, the Potsdam Conference, the Yalta Conference, the whole question of D-Day and how that should have emerged. We will talk about VE Day, We will talk about Churchill's defeat, even at the height of his fame and glory. My God, we have a lot to cover. Yes. Yeah. Potsdam with Harry Truman. Yeah, we're going to get to that. We'll get to Tehran. Oh, I'm getting there too. We're going to cover it all. All right, ladies and gentlemen, stay for the movie. I think you'll enjoy it. Thank you very much.